Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mary Cunningham. I lead the Metropolitan Housing Community Center here at the Urban Institute. We are so excited to share some of our findings from the Housing Crisis Research Collaborative's second year of research. Before we get to that, though, I want to start off by telling you a little bit about the collaborative. It was launched in October 2020. It aims to address the long-standing inequities and access to stable and affordable rental housing that have been laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic. We work directly with policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels to share research and data to inform policy and programs. Since launching, we have published 24 briefs and have an additional 8 briefs that will be published in early 2023. You can find and read that research by visiting housingcrisisresearch.org. I want to take a moment to thank our funders, JPMorgan Chase & Company and the Wells Fargo Foundation. This collaborative has been an amazing opportunity to do fast turnaround research in partnership with our network partners. And I think one of the unique and most important parts of the collaborative is that the research agenda was co-created by our network partners. If we go to the next slide, see our network partners here. These are organizations that are providing guidance and technical assistance and advocating for policy change and directly influencing programs that serve people and communities on the ground. And this structure where we co-create the research agenda really ensures that data and research is being transformed into action. So some recent examples of the collaborative's impact, just to give you a sense of some of our transforming research into action, is the collaborative's researchers inform NACO's Housing Task Force, bringing insights from federal funding flows and the state of the nation's rental housing stock. This task force brings together county government officials from across the nation to illuminate the most critical housing challenges and opportunities from the county government perspective. Collaborative researchers have also been meeting with the White House Domestic Policy Council and leadership at several agencies working on rental housing issues, including HUD and Treasury, at their request to share findings from research on both emergency rental assistance and housing supply. And that work has been informing policy development in those agencies. We are so grateful to have these examples of this work and to really create an impact. We want to thank all the members of the collaborative for their continued partnership. I'd also like to recognize our research partners from the Joint Center for Housing, the Furman Center, and the Turner Center, as well as my colleagues at Urban, Arzo Azizi, Madeline Brown, and Mark Treskin, for their work in putting this event together and for managing this effort at the Urban Institute. Their work is critical to the collaborative success. I also want to thank the Urban Institute's events team for being here today and helping make sure that this all runs successfully. Before I go on to the next and introduce our opening speaker, I just want to do some housekeeping. So this event will be recorded, and as the recording will be posted online after. You can hide captions or adjust settings with the Show Hide Captions button. We're not going to read through speaker biographies today, but they're available online at urban.org. All participants will be muted throughout the webinar today. We are featuring 2 panels today, but instead of a Q&A session, we're going to invite you to offer questions and comments in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll try to respond to them, as many of them as possible. And lastly, we would love for you to complete the survey at the end of the event so we can know how we did and use that information in the future as we plan events. So I'd like to now introduce Solomon Green, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Solomon leads HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research, which informs policy development and implementation to improve life in American communities through conducting, supporting, and sharing research, surveys, demonstrations, program evaluations, and best practices. If you know Solomon, you know he has dedicated his career to improving people's lives and strengthening communities through evidence-based policy and practice. As a former member and key architect of the collaborative in his previous role here at Urban, we are thrilled to have Solomon here to frame our conversation. Welcome, Solomon.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to be the first to thank you, Mary, and the entire Urban team that pulled this event together. It is so timely and important, and I want to echo your thanks for the fellow collaborative members, including the research partners and the network partners. I also want to thank all the presenters who will be sharing their research and insights this afternoon, and all of the participants joining us from across the country today to benefit from that research and those insights. As Mary mentioned, I'm Solomon Green. I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. Mary introduced what we do here at PDNR, but just to echo, we support the department's mission and policy priorities through rigorous research, data collection and analysis, demonstration projects, seeding innovation, and sharing best practices. I've only been in this role since mid-July, but I have long been working on responding to housing unaffordability and instability challenges that predated the pandemic and have only been exacerbated by it. As Mary mentioned, I'm one of the founding members of the collaborative and was fortunate to be able to work on and publish a few of the early papers, and also served on the American Bar Association's COVID-19 Task Force Committee on Evictions and on the Biden-Harris presidential transition team, where I contributed to designing some of the federal policy responses to the eviction crisis. And I want to say at the outset, in all of these roles, I have developed a deep appreciation for the role that timely and actionable research can play and has played in developing housing policy responses to the COVID crisis, and as importantly, in developing evidence-based and community-driven solutions to the ongoing affordable housing and evictions crisis. So in my remarks today, I want to start by taking stock a bit of the breadth of federal interventions to prevent evictions and support housing stability through the pandemic. We've been in this for a while, so it might be worth providing a bit of a refresher on that history. I'll say a bit about what we've learned about those interventions, broadly speaking. Finally, I'll say where I think we can go next and the role that research can play. So winding back the clock a bit, as a reminder, early in the pandemic, the federal government played an important role in providing historic levels of financial support and direct cash assistance to households, including those economic impact payments or stimulus payments in April 2020, December 2020, and March 2021. Under the CARES Act, all states received access to federal funding to provide additional weeks of unemployment insurance to people who exhausted their regular state benefits. And of course, the American Rescue Plan Act enabled households with children to receive $3,000 or more per child in a tax credit through the end of 2021. The CARES Act was the first to provide support directly for local housing specific responses. While it didn't provide direct financial assistance to renters, it did appropriate over $17 billion to HUD for existing programs, including rent assistance and public housing. The CARES Act also created temporary eviction protections and notice requirements for almost all federally assisted and supported housing. And it gave the HUD Secretary broad regulatory waiver authority to assist in addressing the COVID-19 national emergency. And just as the eviction protection in the CARES Act were set to expire, the CDC issued a national eviction moratorium in September 2020, which the Biden-Harris administration extended in March 2021. But it wasn't until the Emergency Rental Assistance Program was launched that federal resources began to address evictions at the needed scale. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program was launched with $25 billion in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 and then a second round of over $21 billion in funding in the American Rescue Plan. It's hard to overstate either the importance of the emergency rental assistance program or the enormity of the challenge in implementing it. It was the first of its kind program that built a national infrastructure to administer $46 billion in emergency rental assistance in record time. In addition to providing rental assistance, ERA also funded over $500 million in housing stability services, like eviction diversion programs and right to counsel. Additional resources were provided in the American Rescue Plan Act. In addition to the $21 billion for emergency rental assistance, ARPA, as I'll call it for some brevity, provided $5 billion in emergency housing vouchers, which funded about 70,000 vouchers, and $5 billion for home ARP to help communities create affordable housing and services for people at risk of experiencing homelessness. But arguably, the most significant pot of funding was the $350 billion state and local fiscal recovery funds. Over $13 billion of those funds have already been committed to various housing uses, making those state and local fiscal recovery funds the largest housing block grant program of all time. So those are some of the big money federal interventions in housing stability through the pandemic, but there are plenty of smaller ones too that have had outsized impact. And the one I'm most proud of, not only because it is administered by PD&R, the office I lead here at HUD, but also because it's had such an incredible reach and impact in a short time, is HUD's Eviction Protection Grant Program, which was launched last year. Also a first of its kind federal program, it was designed to support direct legal services to low-income tenants at risk of eviction. With the infusion of a second round of funding in the current fiscal year, HUD currently funds a total of 21 grantees, providing no-cost legal assistance across 19 states. I should correct myself. It was the additional funding was provided in the fiscal year 22. So in my federal role, I have to remember fiscal years and calendar years don't always align. Just this week, we lost a website for the Eviction Protection Grant Program, and I'll drop the website for that program in the chat. You can find relevant research on evictions and eviction prevention, information about these grants, and most importantly, stories of the people that our grantees have served. So what have we learned from this breadth of federal interventions? First and foremost, we've learned that interventions that combine resources, cash assistance and rental assistance with services and tenant protections work. Given the economic hardship resulting from the pandemic, we would have expected far more eviction cases to be filed in 2021 than were filed in 2019. But the opposite happened. Eviction Lab estimates that 1.36 million evictions were prevented nationwide in 2021 because of the combination of local, state, and national intervention. Treasury estimates state that ERA grantees have expended or obligated more than $40 billion and made more than 7 million unique household payments. And recent Treasury research shows that those ERA funds overwhelmingly went to populations at highest risk of eviction, including Black renters, renters with the lowest incomes, and female-headed renter households. Second, we also learned about the need for a whole of government approach. And by that, I don't only mean between federal agencies, but also those crucial federal-local partnerships. The resources and interventions I mentioned earlier were delivered by the incredible breadth of agencies, CDC, Treasury, FHA, FA, and HUD. And listening to our local partners enabled the federal government to issue successive rounds of guidance in the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that responded to local needs. And HUD continues to work closely with Treasury to make it easier for states and localities to use the state and local fiscal recovery funds for eviction prevention and the preservation and production of affordable housing. Third, we learned about the need to work with and support all actors in the housing ecosystem, renters, owners, and financial institutions. In addition to making it easier for renters to access emergency rental assistance, the Treasury guidance made it easier for landlords to participate in the program and to mitigate hardship for owners. And through FHA and FHFA mortgage forbearance programs, homeowners and landlords were able to temporarily pause or reduce their mortgage payments if they were struggling financially. And finally, and I say this without an ounce of either self-interest or opportunism, we learned a lot about the central importance of research and data. Early federal responses couldn't rely on rich data or research. After all, the crisis was unprecedented, and so was the need for a rapid response. So early on, independent researchers, such as the ones we're going to hear from today and the members of the collaborative, played an essential role, studying early state and local interventions and elevating insights and best practice. Independent research also helped make the case for federal intervention at scale, which ultimately contributed to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. The Census Department also launched the Pulse Survey in June 2020, which has been an invaluable resource for policy and program design. And HUD realized the need to work with private data providers to keep on top of an ever-evolving affordability and eviction crisis. We now meet regularly with private data providers to get real-time sense of emerging trends within rental and home sales markets. And here at HUD, we're also helping to build a national eviction data infrastructure. We're holding stakeholder listening sessions with public housing authorities, tenants and tenant advocates, landlord groups, state and local courts, and others to discuss the way HUD can contribute to the development of data standards and the collection of eviction data. And we recently awarded research grants to explore the feasibility of linking data on court-ordered evictions to HUD administrative data. Finally, we're also supporting independent research to learn from those unprecedented federal investments I mentioned earlier. Most notably, HUD recently awarded $2 million in funding to assess the impact of the emergency rental assistance programs. So where do we go from here? The relative success of federal interventions to date in stemming a devastating surge in evictions during the pandemic should not diminish the urgency for a robust, ongoing federal response. Today, eviction levels in cities across the country are already reaching pre-pandemic levels, and this is simply unacceptable, considering the devastating toll evictions have long placed on renters, particularly renters of color, communities, and particularly communities of color, and society at large. And of course, we are seeing the crushing pressure of rapid rent increases on all households, but particularly lower income renters. Nationally, rents are up over 20% since the start of the pandemic. So what do we do? How do we rise to these challenges? Of course, it will take resources, political will, and people power, but it'll also take new partnerships and a willingness to learn from both our successes and failures over the past 2 years. If anything, the pandemic response should give us hope, more hope, about the importance of a federal housing policy and its potential to make a difference. As hard as it may be to believe in some circles, big, bold innovation action can happen, and great people can help implement it to benefit us all and to benefit those facing the greatest housing challenges. Think about all the incredible work that was done to roll out the emergency rental assistance program, even as everyone was figuring out a new way of working and providing services through a pandemic and in an extraordinary tough environment. Reflecting on that gives me hope for what's next. But I do have questions. How do we sustain and improve state and local housing response infrastructure built during the pandemic? How do we keep the momentum going for a robust and sustained federal response? How do we balance the ongoing need for renter protections and eviction prevention with strategies to address the nation's growing shortage of affordable housing? Who was left out of relief efforts, and who do we need to center as we build a more stable and secure housing market for all families? I'm so heartened to see these questions all over the research that collaborative members and their partners have already published, and the new research we'll be hearing about today. And I look forward to finding the answers together. To get us started, I'll pass the mic and the screen to Makeda Henry-Nicky, the Executive Director of the JP Morgan Chase Institute, who will introduce and moderate the first panel. Thank you.
Uh, Good afternoon, and thank you to our panelists and to our virtual audience for joining us this afternoon to lift up a critically important conversation on funding and supporting rental stability. After decades of browbeating advocacy, we saw the federal government finally respond at scale to a growing trifecta of crises. I don't need to name it, but I will. A public health pandemic, a housing affordability crisis, and untenable housing insecurity among the most vulnerable groups. Today, I'm joined by a terrific panel to discuss how states and localities use the enormous COVID subsidies to stabilize vulnerable residents and what lessons we should be taking forward. Please join me in welcoming Samantha Fu, Senior Policy Associate with Urban Institute's Research to Action Lab. Welcome. Elizabeth Kneebone, Assistant Vice President of Community Development Research with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. And finally, Rebecca Ye, Senior Research Analyst with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Welcome, everyone. Let's get started. We don't have a ton of time. So Sam, I want to kick it to you first. Your research focused on the ways 6 cities and counties use ARPA, state and local fiscal recovery funds to address affordable housing needs. I thought your work was very, very fascinating, well covered. Tell me, was there anything from your findings that was particularly surprising for your team?
Thank you, Makeda. And yes, absolutely. But even before getting to our findings, actually, if I can just take a moment, I think one of the reasons we were interested in pursuing research on this topic in the first place is because we were surprised that so many cities and counties were using the funds for this purpose. Since housing development isn't generally the first thing that comes to mind when you think about ways to use emergency funding, not in the same way as emergency rental assistance that Solomon spoke about, hazard pay, or even direct cash assistance to families. And on top of that, developing or even preserving housing can take a long time. In San Francisco, for instance, where I live, the median time to completion for housing projects is close to 4 years. And some projects obviously can take much, much longer than that. But despite all those hurdles, our analysis of reporting data released by Treasury found that developing or preserving affordable housing was one of the most popular housing-related uses of state and local fiscal recovery funds, or as my team likes to call it, SLRF. And so we were very interested in learning more about how those decisions were made. Interestingly, though, when we posed the why affordable housing question to the dozen or so local representatives that we interviewed, they all pretty much said the same thing, something along the lines of, we have a large shortage of affordable housing, so it's one of our top priorities. So I think that was, a real recognition across all our respondents that increasing the supply of affordable housing, while not an immediate solution to the many crises brought on and exacerbated by the pandemic, was something that would help build future resilience. And so coming back to your question, I think the most striking takeaway from this project for us was really just the scale of the need across all the cities and counties we spoke with, not just in large coastal cities, but also in smaller counties from the South to the Midwest. Our interviewees described a whole host of barriers to using these funds for affordable housing, from short obligation timelines to initial restrictions that required some difficult maneuvering on their parts. And I think the fact that more than 1/5 of all cities and counties receiving state and local fiscal recovery funds were planning to use the funds to increase the supply of affordable housing in their communities, despite the many barriers, really illustrated to us the scale of the need and also the need for more long-term federal funding, not just one-time infusions, to increase housing supply, in addition to, of course, funding for rental assistance programs and other measures that can improve housing stability in the shorter term.
Great, thank you. Sam, I had the pleasure of being able to review your work, and I thought one of the sort of interesting themes that jumped out to me was, interviewees telling you about not having enough time to really put into action thoughtful plans that really engage community members, complaining of burdensome requirements. And I wonder, Elizabeth, if I could ask you and bring you into the discussion, how maybe some of these themes carried over to the emergency rental assistance dollars that you've had a chance to examine across the country. How have they been used in sort of your view, right, to contribute to housing stability? What were the barriers? What did you see that was innovative that we should be lifting up?
Yeah, I had the opportunity to interview dozens of stakeholders across the country who were involved in the implementation of local ERA programs. And it was a mix of communities from big cities to suburban counties to small rural communities. I spoke with government staffers at local agencies, with nonprofits and other intermediaries, all the different perspectives that kind of came to bear on rolling out this program. And before I delve into that, I should note that while today I'm sitting at the SF Fed in my new role. This research was really undertaken through the Housing Crisis Research Collaborative while I was at the Turner Center. And all the things I'm going to discuss today don't necessarily represent the views of the Fed or the Federal Reserve system. But in conducting these interviews, it was clear that with this sort of massive infusion of funds, a brand new program set up through the Treasury Department, by design, there was a lot of opportunity for creativity, for innovation in how to deploy these funds, how to set up these programs. So that while that's a real opportunity, by the same token, it's a massive new program. And that came with a whole host of challenges inherent in that, along with guidelines that were evolving over time. States and localities who immediately had to figure out what is the infrastructure, how do we deploy this program? And a first order question that really came up for the interviewees I spoke with was, what's the capacity among local governments or direct grantees who are receiving these funds to deploy? What were they equipped to take on? And not just what were they equipped to take on, but looking at the sort of ecosystem around them. Were there partners? Were there community-based organizations, nonprofits, intermediaries that were positioned to be able to play a role? Or would it make sense to partner with to try to get these dollars out the door as quickly as possible to the households that were in real urgent need of them? And the way that question was answered it just varied so broadly, because it really reflects the diversity of capacity that exists across different states and localities in being able to reach these households, especially particularly vulnerable populations and hard to reach communities. So we saw, even with this new program, in many cases in the models that I researched, they were leveraging what infrastructure was there. So looking around for trusted partners, HUD grantees, people with organizations with experience in actually administering federal dollars and understanding the complexities of sort of navigating those types of programs. How could they bolster and build on the kinds of infrastructure that may have already been seeded? At the same time, we saw a number of models and organizations finding ways to forge new partnerships and really bring new stakeholders to the table, again, with just the scale and scope of the challenges they were facing, not just looking to housing agencies, but thinking about mental health providers, other social service providers, community action agencies they could bring into these partnerships to help them make sure that they were reaching households that needed these stabilizing funds most critically. And a number of models where they were looking not just at ERA, as thinking about is there an opportunity to create more one-stop shops, or thinking about ERA alongside a suite of other supports that could help bring to bear to stabilize these households. So in a number of places, again, across the gamut of different types of communities, really seeing this kind of all hands on deck mentality. But what that looked like, again, was very different depending on what was there to build from in the first place.
Yeah, that's really a very, very helpful landscape. I think I've seen, innovation come out of nowhere. I mean, I think we usually talk about localities being forced to deal with funding constraints, and see them really sort of bring together a collective of funds and sort of braid them to meet their affordability housing needs and goals. I thought we saw institutions come together and braid a collaborative of networks together to respond to the kinds of capacity constraints we saw emerge in this very fluid situation. So I want to sort of bring you in, Rebecca. Help us kind of abstract and bring some patterns into play at the local level. What patterns did you see across places where these various federal funding streams were in play to use to support renters? Any innovations sort of come to bear that we can sort of take inspiration from?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Makeda, and thanks for having me here today on this panel. As some background, the National Income Housing Coalition has been tracking emergency rental assistance programs that have been stood up during the pandemic, convening a cohort of grantees and partners working on emergency rental assistance and eviction prevention initiatives, as well as conducting research on a number of related issues, just to kind of give some of that context. Just to kind of echo a little bit on what Elizabeth was saying, many agencies, I think this is one of the innovations, many agencies turn to forge or strengthen and deepen their partnerships due to the unique time pressures of a lot of these funding sources that came through, as well as the urgency of impending evictions, agencies really needed to move quickly, get information out quickly, much more quickly than some were necessarily used to, and they frequently collaborated with nonprofits or grassroots organizations or other partners to get the word out about the assistance available, and even sometimes to provide support in that process. In addition, I saw many agencies leaning into flexibilities, especially as time wore on. Programs lowered barriers to applying to the emergency rental assistance program, for instance, reducing documentation burden through the use of self-attestation, adopting categorical eligibility, and kind of using a wide range of ways to reduce documentation and better meet applicants where they were at. Agencies were also able to use some of the funds more creatively to meet their community's own unique needs. So, for example, a recent report from the Coalition on Emergency Rental Assistance in Tribally Designated Housing Entities found that administrators were able to temporarily address overcrowding, which is a long-standing issue on Native lands, by piecing together coverage of relocation expenses, security deposits, and 3 months of future rent. Another, I think, this isn't really an innovation per se, but another observation that echoes what Solomon was actually mentioning in his opening remarks is that programs were just so willing to learn and adapt and engage. And I think that willingness to adapt and engage was really important, just across a wide range of things. The pandemic really brought housing issues to the forefront, such that a lot of localities are committing parts of their state and local fiscal recovery funds to sustaining the eviction prevention initiatives and emergency rental assistance programs, as well as to invest in long-term housing infrastructure, and even, going to the lengths of finding their own local dollars to invest in this. And something that I've been noticing as federal funds, especially emergency rental assistance funds, dwindle, I see some programs grappling with how to kind of more carefully target resources, being put into this position of needing to use more distinguishing criteria on who receives assistance, kind of going back to some of how our housing programs more traditionally work. And I think all of this points back to the need for sustained and adequate federal funding for housing programs. So I'll stop there.
No, fantastic. Really insightful and incredibly important observations. But want to sort of take us forward. I think we can all agree this has been not only a very devastating crisis for communities of color in particular, but we can say that our federal government responded. And but will that kind of funding momentum stay with us and sort of carry forward? I think there are large concerns or questions, perhaps doubts about what will be. But let's talk about the lessons. What lessons can we abstract out of this moment, particularly for the federal government? We've heard speed, fluidity, and federal policy. Those terms usually don't coincide in the federal government, but they did this time. So tell us, Elizabeth, I'll kick it to you and invite Rebecca and Sam if you'd like to weigh in. What lessons are there for the federal government in thinking about the future, right? Designing, disseminating programmatic funds. We heard a lot about these burdensome requirements, and really what does it take to fund affordable housing at the local level, at the federal level moving forward, at least to support local affordable housing investments?
Yeah, I think some of the lessons specific to like emergency response that came out of this were, especially thinking about the varying levels of capacity that localities were starting from in trying to deploy these funds and do that so rapidly. Was that that evolving guidance was so useful in understanding and listening in that feedback loop of what would help to sort of evolve the program as it was rolling out. But there was also, I was hearing a lot from the interviews I spoke with, feeling like those communication channels could be stronger and clearer guidance from the beginning is helpful, because it's you don't want to do things. People are risk averse. They want to be careful stewards of this money, but they're also trying to respond rapidly. And so having that clear feedback loops, having firm guidance, can help them feel like they can get out of the gate a little faster. Along with that, especially thinking from a capacity lens, the larger places that were well equipped, that kind of had the staff and the resources in place, can run with that flexibility of a program like ERA, for instance, in a way that's different from a smaller or mid-sized, more capacity constrained place, where we heard they would really value something like, can you give us some templates for applications that are pre-approved? If we're looking at a back-end solution for technology to sort through all these applications, are there approved vendors that we could go to? Some models that I spoke to or programs were using things like their HMIS system from their homelessness services work, that to have a shared platform for data. Being able to lift things like that up sooner can be helpful in trying to get something like this out of the gate so quickly. So I think that sort of those emergency lessons are really useful for thinking about the next crisis that may be coming down the pipe. But there are also longer term lessons here that I think are really surfaced. This shone a light on where some gaps are, or where there are longer term systemic challenges in being able to deliver these sorts of funds, especially to like vulnerable and long struggling communities who may be less resourced or may have fewer of those capacity resources to draw on. So things like targeted technical assistance, the ability to make braiding of funds easier, I think, again, for that more holistic approach to what it takes to stabilize a household, and understanding that, again, different communities are situated to be able to step into some of those programs differently. Like it takes a lot of capacity even to compete for or apply for federal funding. So how do we make sure that we're delivering resources to the most, or having intermediaries who are able to help make sure we're not leaving behind communities who may not be able to absorb these resources as readily because of capacity constraints. And I think, again, we've spoken to it as well. It's the stabilizing of renters in the moment, but that dearth of affordable rental housing, that supply side piece, that is the longer term solution that needs to be paired with some of these sort of hopefully lessons we're learning about how to stabilize renters as they may be experiencing economic shocks, or even just individual shocks to their budget that might lead to instability. We need to have this pipeline of supply coming alongside, even as we're thinking about those near-term supports for households.
Yeah, I think it's capacity. If nothing else, COVID certainly shocked our local systems into this dichotomy of localities that were well-resourced and could respond in the near time, and others that were overwhelmed, with demand and also supply, and not having the distribution infrastructure in place to bring staff and resources and sort of get it out to the people that are most in need. Sam, I want you to kind of help us develop on this theme of capacity. What can the federal government do moving forward, right, to help build capacity among local governments, particularly in those lower resourced ecosystems?
Yeah, absolutely. And just adding to, echoing Elizabeth's point, we also heard from our interviews that local capacity was pretty much the determining factor in whether and how places were able to deploy the funds quickly for affordable housing purposes. So things like having existing plans in place, having already conducted community engagement, having local partnerships with nonprofit community organizations on the ground, were really, contributors to the places that were able to, quickly deploy the funds and stand up new projects. So I think, as Elizabeth mentioned, providing technical assistance to localities that may be lesser resourced. I think conducting proactive outreach to those places as well. So going to communities and not just waiting for them to come to the federal government, and then also maybe providing funding for pre-development. So before a new funding source even comes into place, providing communities with the funding that they need to start reaching out to communities, to maybe staff up, to create comprehensive plans so that when the funding comes in, they can hit the ground running.
Yeah, makes sense. Rebecca, I invite you to chime in, or maybe you want to, take us in a different direction around, are there specific considerations from your vantage point where you saw opportunities, and maybe you'd like to see more of those, right? Bringing in braiding of federal sources with philanthropic sources, state sources, like help us understand how should we think about this new capital structure that states and localities could be looking to lessons learned to help them inform their own affordable housing needs. And we heard Elizabeth going to bring in that big overhanging question of supply. How are we going to pay for this?
I think those are all really good questions. I think that one thing I'll start out with by saying that I've already mentioned is, I'd love to see future housing programs, whether that's coming from the federal government or whether localities are braiding together different pieces of funding. I'd love to see programs think more carefully about how the program itself can lower barriers for the applicants, for people who are facing their own housing crisis, and how they can better meet renters where they are. I think renters frequently pay with time that they may not have to jump through hoops for programs that are quite high barrier. And so I think that all of this has really showed that this can work. The other thing I'll mention is data collection and evaluation are just such important tools to both keeping the programs accountable, as well as being able to understand who the programs are serving, ensuring that it's equitable, and building the case for future funds, whether that's at the state or local level, whether that's to a foundation, and hopefully even eventually being able to build that case at the federal level. And, as a part of that, I think that this actually calls back to both what Samantha and Elizabeth were talking about, with the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program, the data collection requirements, I think, were a bit challenging for some of the localities that had limited capacity. And so, if the federal government somehow is going to do another emergency rental assistance program, there definitely need to be considerations for more support on this technology aspect.
Yeah, that is a critically important point. I'm pushing you guys for lessons learned, but if we don't have data that is uniformly available, collected in a robust, comprehensive way, it's hard to tell what's anomaly, what's sort of systematic, and how to sort of abstract those really important lessons to feed up to the federal government and sort of distribute across states and localities. So I want to underscore and bold that comment. We don't have a lot of time left, but I would love each of you to help me think about the wind down here. We are at the sunset of these enormous supports. I think some localities still have a lot more subsidies in their pipeline because of these capacity constraints. They're not fully obligated. But what are the thoughts from each of you on, or emerging findings on how localities are facing challenges associated with winding down these federal supports? Sam, Elizabeth, anybody feel free to
Yeah, happy to jump in. I would just say that with state and local fiscal recovery funds specifically, I think most of our interviewees were still very much focused in the place of trying to obligate. So the funds have to be obligated by December 2024, just still a couple of years away, and then fully expended by December 2026. So I think everyone was very much still wrapped up in, how do we get this out in an equitable way that will actually increase the supply of housing in our communities? But even despite that, most of our interviewees were already thinking about ongoing subsidy sources, especially since a lot of the projects that they were focused on were for extremely low income people. So AMI below 30%, for instance, or people, with other special needs. And so I think they were looking to, a variety of state, local, and philanthropic sources for ongoing rent subsidies and providing supportive services. And I think, again, that sort of underscores the need for more consistent long-term federal funding for these purposes, and for increasing the supply of affordable housing generally. So maybe I'll leave it there and kick it to Rebecca or Elizabeth.
Yeah, I can share that the interviewees I spoke with, there were a lot of concerns about how much they would be able to preserve once these funds are exhausted. We're speaking about emergency rental assistance specifically, that there were definitely positives coming out of this, things that they felt like some of the technological infrastructure and back-end capabilities they were able to build, a lot of the collaborative relationships that they had formed or strengthened, they felt very positive about and saw those persisting moving forward. But when it comes to some of the other capacity extensions they were able to provide around some things like staffing or the actual ability to provide aid to households to avoid eviction, they were very less clear. And many of the models or programs I spoke to were looking to ways to backfill, exactly as Sam was pointing to, thinking about, are there other federal sources, are there other state or local wells that they could draw from, but pretty much acknowledging that it would be a much smaller, slimmed down program, or their ability would be curtailed pretty significantly once these dollars are gone. So I think some of this just remains to be seen, but it's not for lack of trying to find ways to patch this together or figure out ways to preserve what they've seen as a really effective sort of strategy to help stabilize these households. So I think there's, again, more that data collection, that research needs to continue too, to see how these sort of transitions kind of go to ground in different types of communities and what we see persisting longer term.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what all the things that have been said. It's really difficult to say at this moment. A lot of localities are really struggling with this. You know, from emergency rental assistance, many localities are turning to the state and local fiscal recovery funds, which also have a deadline. And after that, I think that's a really big question mark that the coalition is trying to better understand. You know, at the end of the day, this is kind of less a federal recommendation per se, but kind of more a call for the importance of what community organizing and what localities can do to kind of track, you know, what's going on in their communities around their own local housing issues, elevating that, and kind of keeping on, because at the end of the day, the biggest thing is going to be sustained and adequate federal funding.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have, in a few seconds we have left. I'd love to do a quick round robin. Like racial equity was a big theme pushed down from the White House all throughout. So I wondered if there are any racial equity structures that you think will persist with localities, with states, as they sort of continue to think through housing equity issues, how they distribute these dollars and make sure communities of color are disproportionately benefiting this time around. Any quick reflections you guys want to offer?
Yeah, so one interesting thing we had heard from a couple of our interviewees actually were that they had stood up, you know, new equity review processes and or boards post-pandemic as sort of a way to review kind of new projects that were coming in with so much federal funding. And they, you know, it varied in implementation between the localities, but it ranged from, you know, having sort of like an equity scorecard against which they would check off like criteria for different projects, to like having an actual, you know, board or committee which would work with departments and review their plans and, you know, help them create tools to really center equity in the projects that they were pursuing. So, you know, I'm pretty, you know, it was really exciting to hear that. I have the sense that that sort of structure is intended to last, you know, past the crisis. And I think our interviews also expressed that they thought it was, you know, a pretty efficient way to kind of integrate equity review and racial equity into, you know, and kind of balance that with the need to get these emergency funds out really quickly.
Great. Elizabeth or Rebecca, any of the racial equity observations from your world?
Yeah, I appreciate what Rebecca was saying about the challenges or complexities with the reporting requirements that some communities face with the ERA program and getting that data back to Treasury. At the same time, I think collecting that data, being asked for that data, we saw a number of programs really using it in real time to track where their applications were coming from. It informs some new partnerships, the realization, oh, we're underrepresented in certain communities we know might be struggling right now, so let's reach out to new community partners and grassroots organizations. So I think that having that data and that real-time requirement to feed that back really did help inform strategies in a way that can persist and be applicable to other efforts moving forward.
And one other thing I'll add to all of that's all of the above is, working with organizations and tenants to kind of better understand their perspectives and needs kind of when the program is being conceived, as well as a checkpoint on the program to really make sure that it is doing what it's supposed to be doing, just as kind of a last word.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're at time. I want to make space for our second panel. I'd love to thank each of our panelists and introduce the second moderator, Zach Newman. Zach is the co-founder, executive director, and attorney at the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project and a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. Zach, the mic and the camera passes to you.
Thanks, Makeda. Great to be here, y'all. Good to see everyone. I was just so excited to be asked to facilitate this panel. I think here in Denver, Colorado, where we are based, ERA has made a real difference for our clients. We've seen its impact. And I think as ERA, as emergency rental assistance winds down, we're all asking the same question, which is what did we learn? What went well? And also now, how do we prevent evictions when that emergency rental assistance is totally used up? Because it has been such a powerful tool. I'm joined today by a great panel. I'm going to introduce everybody and then we'll get to some questions. We've got with us today Alexa Eisenberg from the University of Michigan. She is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Poverty Solutions Lab there. Ray Kong, who is legal director at Lawyers for Equal Justice in Hawaii at the Hawaii Appleseed Center for Law and Economic Justice. And then finally, Kathy O'Regan, who is a professor of public policy and planning, director of the Master of Science in Public Policy program, and director of the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy at NYU. So great panel. And Kathy, if you don't mind, I will start with a question for you based on your research brief. So your work looks specifically at eviction practices across subsidized housing in New York State. I would just love to hear what were some of the big picture patterns you uncovered across the state, and maybe how generalizable do you think those are to other markets, other states, other communities?
Great. Thank you, Zach. And let me back up and explain why we did the work in the first place, which is we were very surprised to see how little was known about eviction practices in the subsidized stock. And yet you might think that government officials have a vested interest in the stock they subsidize, and they also have more policy levers, right, that they can affect those filings. So we examined filings and subsequent outcomes among various types of subsidized housing from 2016 through the present, using New York State administrative data for all city and county courts throughout the state. So it covers about 83% of renter households in New York. And so 3 high-level findings. One is eviction filing rates are considerably higher among public housing compared to other subsidized housing. And that's very consistent across the jurisdictions and markets. So it holds in New York City, and it's even more true in the softer markets upstate. So I would say this is probably generalizes to a large number of places outside New York State. Second thing is we do see a lot of variation. We see variation across jurisdictions and PHAs, but also across individual properties within a PHA, suggesting considerable managerial discretion. So there are public housing properties operating in the same PHA under their rules, under the same HUD rules, who somehow have very low filing rates. So we could come back to that. And then the last takeaway is very important. The share of eviction filings that ultimately result in warrants of eviction is consistently lower in public housing. So said differently, these higher filing rates do not translate into higher rates of evicting tenants from public housing. And when you pair that with the much lower payment amounts that are being sought in these cases, we're interpreting this as seeing PHAs using filings as a rent collection strategy. So as we begin our conversation about policies and reforms, we should be thinking about address developing alternative mechanisms for collecting rent that do not use housing court in this way. And I'll stop at that.
Thanks, Kathy. That's really interesting. And I have a lot of follow-up questions, but I will save them for a moment. I'd like to go to Alexa now. Alexa, your work really, I think, uncovered some really interesting findings about evictions in Detroit that weren't solely related to the pandemic. For example, your team found that 9 in 10 pandemic-era eviction filings involve properties operated unlawfully by landlords in violation of the City of Detroit's rental ordinance. As you look to the future of eviction prevention in Detroit, what opportunities do you see to better respond to these longer standing issues? What are some strategies that we might be thinking about?
Thanks for the question. I'll talk about this particular finding and what it says about the landscape of eviction and justice in Detroit. But I also want to make a note that just while conditions in Detroit are somewhat extreme, given the city's pronounced history of racism and poverty, they're really not abnormal. And I think we can learn a lot from Detroit about how the structure of our current housing and legal system shapes and really fundamentally limits the effectiveness of rental protections in poor communities of color across the US. So for context, Detroit's rental housing stock is mostly single family homes. It's been seriously deteriorated due to an array of factors, including historically and persistently weak code enforcement. Most poor renters reside in the private market, where housing conditions are often severe and sometimes dangerous. Currently, just 10% of Detroit's rental properties are code compliant. And so the finding that 9 in 10 evictions is filed by non-compliant landlords is not surprising, but it is a jarring reflection of an unjust power dynamic that pervades the entire legal eviction process. You know, the legal contract between landlords and tenants should be a two-way obligation. Tenants pay rent in exchange for providing a safe and decent place to live. But, you know, what our findings show is that the court is really blatantly privileging one party's rights over the others and enabling landlords to collect debts and evict tenants without really any consequence for whether they themselves are following the law. And this starts with the city, this norm of non-enforcement, but it gets passed on to and continues with the court. Instead of enforcing compliance at the stage of filing, the court shifts responsibility onto tenants, who are expected to raise code violation as a defense. But 1 in 5 tenants we've seen just has access to an attorney that's much higher than historically. And they can only raise that defense if they're facing eviction for non-payment of rent. But because there are no just cause protections in the private market, we also saw those types of filings increase, no cause filings, termination of tenancy filings increased dramatically during the pandemic. So, you know, we can also look at this injustice for the opportunity it presents. If the court were to move eviction prevention upstream and bar non-compliant landlords from filing evictions, it could incentivize compliance, prevent thousands of unlawful evictions, and reduce caseloads. And then right to renew policies and just cause, as well as the right to counsel, could make it harder for landlords to flout the law. And this can happen inside or outside of a pandemic. But I think as we look towards the future of eviction prevention, we need to be real in that our rental protections are really only as good as our ability to enforce them. And our enforcement mechanisms are distorted within a for-profit housing system where poor folks rightfully fear retaliation, a current court system that makes it nearly impossible to hold landlords accountable, and a political environment where state and local officials, due to the scarcity of subsidized housing and rent controls, come to view code enforcement and other protections as double-edged swords that will end up harming tenants by reducing, naturally occurring affordable housing. And so this is just to say that our rental protections can really never be divorced from our need to create truly affordable rental housing outside of the private, unregulated rental market.
Thanks, Alexa. I love that framing. And certainly here in Colorado, where I work, I think that analysis also applies across the board. So just a lot of agreement in terms of how you frame that. Ray, your work looked closely at Hawaii's Act 57, which mandates a pre-litigation mediation process. Can you talk a little bit about that process, your findings, and maybe specifically what they indicate about how the state of Hawaii can support renter stability moving forward?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to share. Act 57 was enacted to deal with what was expected to be, an increase in eviction filings once the eviction moratorium ended. And so they enacted this program in which landlords who were only seeking who would only be seeking an eviction due to non-payment of rent, they had to pre-litigation go or offer the tenant mediation. And if the tenant agreed, then they would mediate first. If the tenant didn't agree or the tenant didn't respond, then and only then could the landlord file their eviction action. And so what we were able to look at is the mediation program pre-COVID, the Act 57 mediation program, and in the interim during the pandemic, landlords were trying to find ways to circumvent the eviction moratorium, file lawsuits in eviction cases in which they would allege something other than non-payment of rent. But in a lot of our discussions with legal aid societies and others, including judges, clearly attempts just trying to circumvent. So we could see what effects the program had on both the Act 57 participants. And so that program, the main differences were that it was pre-litigation. Mediators were hired instead of volunteers. They had 1.5 hours per mediation instead of the usual 20 to 30 minutes at the courthouse. Rent relief was available, and mediations could be conducted over Zoom. And so with those changes, we would expect a higher success rate than pre-COVID, and clearly that panned out. Pre-COVID, mediations were settling at about 47%, but the real number that's important is that only 11% of those tenants ended up in a settlement in which they stayed in their unit or their house. The Act 57 cases settled at 87 for the cases that we reviewed. The settlement agreements we reviewed settled at an 87% rate, but 85% of those stayed in place. So 85% to 11% staying in place, and the first reaction is, well, of course, that's because of all the rent relief. But we were able to look at those summary possession cases that were filed during COVID, where the landlords were alleging something other than just non-payment of rent to circumvent. Those cases utilize a lot of the Act 57 mediation parameters. So they had access to rent relief. They mediated over Zoom. They had the longer 1.5 hours. They did use volunteers instead of the hired mediators. And they were, of course, they were in litigation. So that was the other main difference. Those cases settled at about 52%. So better than pre-COVID, but significantly less than pure Act 57. And here's the other important number. Only 20% of those cases resulted in the tenants staying in place. So even though they still had access to rent relief, even though they had longer mediation sessions, the number of tenants staying in place significantly higher than pre-COVID, almost double, but significantly less than just the pure Act 57. So 85% to a 20%. So why is there this big difference? What are the differences between those two groups? Well, the only two main differences are that they were pre-litigation for Act 57, and they had hired mediators. Now, maybe we could give some percentage back because maybe some of those were real cases in which there were real issues other than just a non-payment of rent, but clearly that was in the minority. So I mean, we think what our results indicate is that pre-litigation is a big component to having housing stability as part of an eviction mediation program. In my own personal experience, as a trial lawyer and representing tenants in the eviction cases, once you're in litigation, there's another dynamic. Landlords tend to now they're spending money on lawyers, so they're digging in their heels. Tenants are completely shell-shocked most of the time. Most of the time they're not represented by, I think it's like in Hawaii, it's like 95+% of tenants are not represented by counsel. They're in a courthouse where they're unfamiliar, and it's stressful. So we're hoping that the Act 57 program has sunset. So we're hoping to advocate for bringing back some of those measures to try to address the stability component and add more stability to housing by being able to settle cases and have tenants remain in place in their homes. So those are the main findings of our study.
Thanks, Ray. I really appreciate that reflection, and cool to hear about the program. I guess, one of the things that stood out for me, both from the last panel and reading all of your briefs, is how much innovation has occurred in the space, how much integration of services has taken place, as Elizabeth referred to in the last panel. You all have spent time looking at different interventions, different tools. Now, as ERA is going away and a lot of the adjacent funding that supports these wraparound services that is delivered with rental assistance, these programs in many parts of the country are going to have to get more narrow or really focus on a single tool or a couple of tools. I would maybe ask each of you just very quickly, as you look at all the different things that have been tried and you consider your own research, if there was a single tool or a couple of tools that you were to say, this really has the biggest impact, what would that be? And maybe take us through a little bit of that analysis. And if it's okay, I'll go to Alexa first.
I think, not sure if I am going to answer this in terms of the most impactful by far, but I think right now I'm in this headspace in Michigan. One thing that we weren't necessarily expecting, but what we saw was the Supreme Court of Michigan make pretty pronounced rule changes to the summary proceeding process. One of the largest being the institution of a pretrial hearing in eviction court, which didn't exist prior to that. And it's a pretty, basic component to add, to the eviction process. But we saw default judgments, decrease by about 40% during the pandemic, which is really pronounced. And one, I think, ill-advised way that really a lot of the eviction prevention work was happening and continues to is most of it happens in the courtroom. Rental assistance is being linked in the courtroom. And so the really exceptionally high rate of defaults, prior to the pandemic, and it continues to be the largest driver of evictions is default judgments. But we saw, there's many things happening at the same time. We can't conclude causally that the pretrial hearings were, causing the decline in defaults, but that is something that doesn't cost, technically any money. And it's an easy change to kind of keep in place. However, we did see recently the court proposed to make it a permanent court rule, which was really exciting for advocates. However, the backlash of the landlord industry was swift and pronounced, extremely organized, really just adding a 7-day period to the summary proceeding process, which can go from notice to bailiff eviction in 27 days prior to the pandemic, really brought a huge backlash. And so that's a challenge, but I am thinking about, the court procedures, trying to address like what I was talking about earlier in terms of this really just very one-sided system in court. And I think just, doing our best, it's really interesting to hear about the work in Hawaii, but moving our resources outside of the courtroom where they kind of get wrapped up into that inequity and contorted in that way.
Thanks, Alexa. And you mentioned Ray's comment, so Ray, I'll come back to you. Really curious to hear, what are the things that we need to preserve? What are the things we can preserve? What's having the biggest impact, in this environment where resources are really starting to dwindle?
I interviewed a lot of tenants who participated in the process. I interviewed lawyers who represented landlords and mediators. And I think a very simple tool, but very helpful, is allowing mediations to occur via teleconference or Zoom type services. I think there's no question in my mind that being able to use Zoom benefits both parties in a variety of ways. One, for tenants, they don't need to leave their home, or they can be in a comfortable place where they feel comfortable. Maybe that means that they don't have to commute, find a way to get to a courthouse, find childcare, all of these extra expenses for someone who is facing this difficult situation of potential eviction goes away simply because they can sit in their home and use computer service. Lawyers like Zoom. because they don't have to travel either. They can be in their office, they click in, easy peasy. The other thing that I heard from mediators were that tenants felt comfortable using Zoom because they could also turn off the camera, right? So not only are they no longer in the physical proximity of someone who they might feel shame with because they haven't paid their rent, or someone that they are butting heads with because they are having issues with their landlord, they're also not present with an attorney, representing a landlord, and so they don't have to have that angst about being in a very uncomfortable place. Oftentimes the courthouse, many times this is their first time in a courthouse. It's very daunting for someone who's not represented by a lawyer, will probably got lost trying to figure out where to go in the first place. So utilizing Zoom, I think, is a huge, huge step to removing leverage from landlords who are represented. Most of the Act 57 cases that we reviewed, the pre-litigation cases, very few lawyers involved. And I'm a lawyer, so I hear, we all have a lot of lawyer jokes and all, but clearly people can settle cases without lawyers. And perhaps in a lot of eviction cases, maybe it makes it easier. If a lawyer is involved, they are going to need to feel like they need to validate their fees to their client. They're going to be pushing harder for something that might be more severe, which ends up in a tenant leaving. Instead of bigger picture, how do we work this out? In our review of the settlement cases, the most of the amounts that were paid in the rent relief or that part of the settlement were $1,000 to $2,000. So we're not talking about huge amounts of money that needed to be paid back so that a tenant could stay. $1,000 to $2,000. Now, where do we find that money with all that money with rent relief disappearing? Different question. But I think Zoom and teleconference type systems like this should be utilized. I utilize it in my own practice now. I haven't been to a mediation since the pandemic. I've been to about 10 over Zoom, and every single one of them settled. I don't see any significant difference in not being in a room with my client or the mediator or the opposing side. So that's the one main thing that other things definitely have impacts, but that is one that is simple to implement, which I think can have a huge effect.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah, I'll flag, we've had similar experiences here in Colorado, and there's a bill coming up in the Colorado legislature that will require a Zoom option. And what we've heard from clients is that it's easier to go to hearings, they can stay at work, don't have to travel across town. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, let's, Kathy, we'd love to come back to you. Curious what you think on this, what to preserve in a limited resource world, and feel free to interpret this writ large or specifically in cases being handled by housing authorities.
I'll do two things. I'm going to thread a little bit through what Ray and Alexa said to think about a framing of how to think about these tools and interventions. What I really appreciate is you've kind of bookended like where in the process, both because of when you get to tenants. We're doing some work here on tenant non-responses and defaults. And so more than half of cases in New York City housing courts, you don't have a response from the tenant and you're twice as likely to get a default judgment, right? And so if the resources are in housing court, you've missed half of the cases. But Ray's really adding a human component to it, which is the litigation stage versus when you're not in that frame. And so that's another way to think about it. And that may also affect who you want involved, lawyers versus mediators, et cetera. And it's a good way we could take the things that have been tried. They can look rather similar across jurisdictions, except who's implementing it or exactly where, and you could get a very different outcome, right? So I want to think about that. The second thing, Alexa brought up cost. And I want to talk about that with the public housing authorities, and to think holistically about cost, right? So she gave an example, 7-day extension doesn't sound like that would have a high cost on the landlords, but and Ray did the opposite. You change to Zoom, you really lower the cost. So thinking very holistically about what is a true cost to a player. So for the public housing authorities, what they're talking about is the cost of not having their rent is putting, making their properties financially not viable. So we need to come up with another tool. If they're seeing this as rent collection and that's going to cost, they're at huge risk from that, we got to give them something else instead of housing court. And if we think about these interventions and what it means for true cost, if you really raise the cost on landlords, it's going to show up somewhere, lower maintenance, higher screening. Like, we're going to have to think about when it really does and doesn't, and can we come up with something else that really would actually lowers the cost that they care about.
I love that frame, Kathy, and I think that's a good way to think about and drive solutions. And I just wonder if you don't mind a direct question, do you think that, and to some extent this is difficult in statute, but we should be thinking about the kind of private large landlords differently than we think about housing authority? Or is there a way to navigate that and how we approach these questions?
Well, I absolutely think that we collectively and our government should be thinking very differently about the properties it subsidizes and regulates, because with the subsidy comes regulation. So, the Public Housing Authority in New York City just made a vast change in the way that it's doing eviction filings to address that very large variation that I was talking about. So it's going to centralize it so we can make it sure it's more equitable. And it has just eliminated 90% of the non-payment payment cases that were pending. It's like, no, we're only going after, in the future, only going after those who have like 2 years of arrears. So there's a public housing authority that's decided to do this. HUD can give guidance and explain to other public housing authorities that it is actually feasible within existing rules to use a different set of strategies for achieving rent collection rather than the housing court. But they're risk averse. We heard this with the low capacity places in the last panel. They want templates. They want to know something is okay from those who fund them and regulate them. And HUD is that entity for the public housing and subsidized stock. So I think we should be more aggressive about policies in that space because we have more tools.
Thanks, Kathy. Well, we've got, I think, about 8 or 9 minutes left here. And so I want to pivot a little bit and talk a bit about what a federal eviction prevention program might look like going forward, what partner components would be necessary to ensure its success, who needs to be a part of that conversation, and then, what might the design of that look like? So Ray, would love to start with you, and we'll take it from there.
I mean, funding, we're going to need funding. But as was mentioned earlier, we're going to need to narrow it, right? So like, what is this post-COVID non-disaster type funding look like? And really making it part of housing stability and just looking at it not as an emergency, but just part of housing stability. It just needs to become part of how we deal with our housing issues. And, one of the things to look at is how do we narrow it? How much can people get? How long can they get it? For COVID, we do have some data where some people received in excess of $40,000, covering 14 months of rent. But as I mentioned before, the average was really like $1,000 to $2,000. So in Hawaii, that is a month to a month and a half on average of rent to be covered. And so we need to figure out is what is the right gap period that needs to get covered? How do we, and I think some type of educational component needs to be included. How do we help those who need this gap understand, maybe it's relating to budgeting, so that they don't get back into the same situation as before when funding might not be available. Those are some thoughts that I have.
Thanks, Ray. And Alexa, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. Part of the way we framed me and my co-author Kate Brantley framed our recent publication was through this lens of treating eviction like the public health crisis that it is. So monitoring, preventing, and eradicating, and working on those three things in tandem. I think at the federal level, I've seen the Homes Guarantee campaign has come out with some great ideas for monitoring the eviction crisis through a national landlord registry and eviction database, and using its enforcement powers, as well as, like Kathy mentioned, the subsidies that it provides, and using its regulatory powers to really provide a full system of eviction prevention in that landscape. And so that that requires resources, but also instilling rights, a renter's bill of rights at the federal level, as well as enforcing, for instance, just cause policies and subsidized properties. But really, I mean, the federal government has this unique ability to actually address the root cause of eviction, which is the country's lack of subsidized and publicly owned low-income housing. And so this needs to be a top priority. And I think these are not either or scenarios. But we need the funding for eviction diversion and rental assistance, but need to be also be clear-eyed that so long as low-income housing is going to be provided for profit, these funds are really only stably housing people temporarily. And during the pandemic, in Detroit, we saw, especially when participation by the landlord is necessary for the housing stability to occur. What we were seeing just in the court data that we've analyzed is that landlords circumventing ERA programs, filing termination, opting to kick tenants out rather than accept the funds, amid the housing, the rising rents. And so I think, creating flexible funding also in Michigan, tenants were able to receive the funds if landlords didn't participate. But what we saw time and time again is that they often didn't get the funds quickly enough because of backlogs and means testing, that made it impossible for local government, the local agencies to act quickly, as well as a lot of people lived in hotels for up to a year trying to find just somewhere where they could live that was safe and affordable, even with rent covered for several months. And so, what I want to emphasize about a federal platform is flexibility, is thinking about the business models of landlords, and then ultimately, working this mitigation strategy alongside a far bolder elimination strategy that involves investing in public and social housing.
Thanks, Alexa. Well, Kathy, we've got 5 minutes left and you're going to wrap us. So maybe what I'll do is hand it to you to address the federal eviction prevention question, and then also bring this to a close today.
Great incentive for me to be on time since I have to do the closeout. Thank you. So agree with the big levers that Ray and Alexa are talking about. So let me talk about two specific things that are within the purview of the federal government. So one is really on the HUD side, is understanding why rates in public housing are so much higher than in Section 8 properties, where you have the private landlords, the federal subsidy, similar households, and income determined rent. And yet they don't have as high filing rates. And so are there specific HUD rules or practices in the way that HUD assesses public housing authorities? So it's right within their capacity to affect, and they should, I think, be sort of very focused on figuring that out. And the second thing is both HUD and Treasury in thinking about looking forward to yet potentially another round of collateral damage for credit scores and payment histories that have been damaged during the pandemic, coming back into tenant selection practices for federally subsidized private sector landlords. So HUD can issue guidance. Treasury could be making recommendations to state HFAs on LIHTC landlords on how and whether they use those most recent credit scores. And some state HFAs have gone ahead and built that into their practice, but we should be doing this in the federal level so that it hits a much larger share of the stock. And so then I guess I've just used my 4 minutes on that piece. And I had to do it while Solomon was still here. So we have the ears of some, at least federal officials here. And so with that, I think I'm now tasked with the pleasure of closing out what has really been a great panel and day for us. I want to start by just thanking not just the panelists here, but the previous speakers and the audience in particular for coming and spending an hour and a half with us on an afternoon. I want to thank you, Zach, for moderating this panel. I also want to thank our funders, JP Morgan Chase and Company and Wells Fargo, and the network partners for their ongoing support during this entire time. I've been an academic for a long time. I've never been in a partnership like this. It has been really different, and getting to be in partnership with the practitioners and trying to be useful over and over for a prolonged period of time with their flexibility on how we use the funding, including opening up to sets of researchers like Alexa and Ray. And then the last thing that I want to do, and I may actually have shaved a minute off of our time, I want to remind everyone that the recording will be posted online and shared after the event. And then I guess I'll just make a plug that everybody just saw in chat that there is a moment, there is an event survey that the Urban Institute is asking people to fill out. It would be extremely helpful for us if you could take maybe that 1.5 minutes that I've just saved on people's afternoon to click on that and provide some responses. So I think with that, I'm going to give people 1 minute back on their Thursday afternoon. Thank you all. This has been terrific.